Good evening. We apologize most sincerely to those of you who may have clicked on this video thinking that it was in any way connected with the subject of censorship of the comedy television program Monty Python's Flying Circus. This was due to an error in the extraction stage of the video upload. This video is in fact called Faceless Low-Level YouTuber Rants About a Show That Ended Decades Ago, Try Not to Point and Laugh Challenge, compiled by Brian Kish. Good evening. We apologize for the previous apology. This video is in fact called Monty Python's Flying Censored, and we'll be taking a look at examples of censorship during the original run of Monty Python's Flying Circus from 1969 to 1974. This is only in reference to the TV series, so nothing from the movies, books, or albums will be focused on in this video. I'll only highlight the instances of the Pythons and the BBC having a disagreement in suitability of content. So this does not include the various times that bits had to be overdubbed due to music rights clearance issues, or other missing bits that were taken out for other reasons. These are sketches that by all known accounts were censored by the BBC, everything from a line of dialogue to a full sketch entirely. Barry Took, comedy advisor to the BBC, who was instrumental to the formation of Monty Python, went to bat for the emerging show, railing against any BBC network interference. I wanted to impose the antithesis of censorship or control. It sounds like a contradiction, but I wanted to say to them, look, if you let people run free, they'll produce better work than if they're constrained in old-fashioned formulas. They say you can't do that because it's never been done before. But the other side of that is, we must do that because it's never been done before. I said optimistically that once we gave these young men their head, they're so bright, how could it not work before it ever happened? And every piece of evidence suggests that the initial guess was the right one. This is corroborated in a Terry Jones interview with the Sunday Times in April 1987. When we started doing Python in 1969, the BBC was completely different from the way it is now. It was producer-led and very anarchic. They were highly conscious of not censoring anything, very keen not to be seen to be censoring anything. Consequently, no heads of department would ever vet programs before they went out. Criticism always came after the fact, so they couldn't be accused of censorship. The Pythons actually had a contractual agreement with the BBC that a script couldn't be altered without prior notice. Here's a quote from Graham Chapman regarding the rearranging of shows once episodes were already filmed. It happened for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there had been an objection in the form of, no, you can't do that because of something that happened in the news, like an airplane crash when we'd just done a sketch about an airline. Well, we can't put that out for a week or two. That sort of thing happened a little, and some sketches were also removed because of censorship, though I've found it very hard to be specific about that. Well, I'm gonna try my best, old horse. Let's start right in on Season 1. Episode 2, Sex and Violence. Technically, the first bit of censorship was in the Mouse Problem sketch. Mega successful TV producer and host David Frost essentially put his ass on the line to get the Pythons their own show. And granted, he wasn't the only one who deserves credit. There's also Michael Mills and Barry Took, for example. But as much as the Pythons liked to deny it, and as much as they were given full autonomy, it was David Frost's risk to take, so what did they do? In the first episode they ever filmed, second to be broadcast, they literally doxed the guy by putting his real home phone number up on screen. This is within the context of the sketch and doesn't explicitly say this is Frosty's number, but can you imagine the unmitigated gall? Sometimes it's reported as being his production office phone number and sometimes his home phone number. Frost would go on to get so many phone calls after the episode's airing that he prevailed upon the BBC to take out his personal info. As you can see from this letter from John Howard Davies to Ian McNaughton, who was the series' principal director, they received considerable pushback for the first instance of Frost's phone number and had to overdub Cleese's voice. The master tape now had a new graphic added, so up until the recent Blu-ray version restored the original pre-edited version, this censored version was what we saw for all these years. The sketch was also recorded for the first and rather lackluster Monty Python self-titled album. In this version, recorded about 9 months later, the number is changed completely and the character's name is switched from Arthur Jackson to George Jackson. It was also originally written for inclusion in the devastatingly underrated movie The Magic Christian, which Cleese and Chapman both appear in and wrote some degree of material for. The name Arthur Jackson also happens to be the name of a famous composer also known as Two Sheds. The vocational guidance counselor sketch also initially featured Frost Cross phone number, but was cut out before the show was aired. And there was apparently another Season 1 sketch that gave away his home address, but that was re-edited before that episode first aired. Man, they do not play around. They didn't bite the hand that feeds, they put it in a shredder. Episode 5, Man's Identity Crisis in the Latter Half of the 20th Century. The next example of censorship, a drug reference, was cut from the Sandy Camp drug raid sketch in possibly the most garish apartment set ever committed to film. In a botched attempt to plant drugs on Idol, Chapman's constable instead leaves sandwiches.
Blimey, whatever did I give the wife?
Here BBC East Grinstead.
If that cut seems sloppy to you, it's because an extra line was cut right at the end.
But then they only cut to the wife going, I don't know, but it was better than lunch. And the BBC wouldn't have that. They cut that.
As a general rule, if something gets a huge laugh, you would think that would be reason enough to leave it in the show, but even the suggestion of a drug reference was deemed too risque. On the same show that has nude ladies and violence abound. The line was also apparently delivered with the housewife batting eggs across the kitchen with a frying pan, or according to the Monty Python wiki, an actual tennis racket, though I assume it's the former. There's no indication that the original clip from this section still exists, but who knows, maybe it'll turn up one day. And now we move on to Season 2 with Episode 15, The Spanish Inquisition. Luckily, this next quick bit was not censored on the A&E DVDs I grew up with, so I'm quite familiar with the episode ending in the middle of Palin's character saying, "Oh, bugger!" According to an article titled Monty Python, The Early Years, published in The Listener on June 28, 1979, the BBC made the decision to deprive viewers in Scotland of the punchline of the brilliant Nobody Expects the Spanish Inquisition edition. Once again, this gets a great big laugh, and perhaps that's what persuaded the BBC from cutting this line out. It does make you wonder, though, what would the alternative be? Just cutting to the end with no laughter? Or a shoddy voiceover? Interestingly, the same article also makes the case that the BBC should be a force to butt heads with, noting, it would probably have been fatal if the BBC had welcomed and applauded by every notion. They needed the arguments with Paul Fox. Episode 19, It's a Living. A particularly significant case of censorship was in Season 2's It's a Living during the Prince animation. This is a pretty well-known one. In the original broadcast, the Prince dies of cancer, but in every subsequent broadcast, cancer is crudely replaced with the word gangrene, and it doesn't appear to be the voice of any of the Pythons. To make matters more confusing, it appears IMDb erroneously credits Rita Davies as the narration voice, when, to my ears, it's definitely Carol Cleveland. Gilliam alludes to the animation in The Pythons. They changed cancer to gangrene because cancer had become a word you couldn't make a joke about. What an extraordinary time that in a repeat on BBC Two, you can't say cancer in a cartoon. This incident of censorship is so blatant that it has the appearance of actually being intentional as a meta joke typical of Python's fourth wall breaking humor, but being an example of the BBC being unsubtle is more likely. This was the version I grew up with on the A&E DVDs. Luckily, the newest Blu-ray copies of the series revert to the original uncensored audio, and the word cancer also remains uncensored when this section was reanimated for, and now for something completely different. Episode 24, How Not to Be Seen. The censors must have had a hard no with regard to the word cancer, because the episode How Not to Be Seen, which features at least 2 instances of censorship, also sees the word cancer being censored.
Finally, these tactless references to leprosy and terminal cancer.
This extra bit survived through a black and white telerecording, or what us Yanks call kinescope. First, a line of dialogue was cut from the beginning of the episode in Conquistador Coffee, which mentions cancer, but the line doesn't get much of a laugh anyhow, and the edit is reasonably seamless. This bit is noticeably still absent from the episode itself on the Blu-ray, and can only be seen in color uncensored as a bonus feature, and the version on Kinescope still exists uncensored on YouTube. However, the much more notorious cut was in Terry Gilliam's animation that begins at the end of the Crackpot Religions section. Originally, a priest nails his head shut after a demon continually pops out, and the sketch abruptly moves on to How Not to Be Seen. But the original animation at one point cuts to figures on telephone poles doubling as crucifixes. The whole bit moves along quite briskly, perhaps less than 30 seconds, but This sequence was really spooky and illuminating to me when I was 12 and 13 because it was offensive and the only record of it was, again, a shoddy black and white recording. Interestingly, there are still traces of the censored animation even in the finished censored episode. During the episode's closing joke of cutting through the episode extremely quickly, 2 shots are still visible. There are also all sorts of accounts in terms of why it was cut, whether or not it premiered with the animation or not, both in the UK and US, and who pushed for the cut. The consensus seems to suggest that it was not broadcast in the UK, but it was in the States, though it was cut from future reruns from that point on. After the bit performed reasonably well, they, or according to Gilliam, John Cleese, still opted to cut the offending bit. Gilliam explains, "There was something I think John was behind once. Ian McNaughton got the blame for it, but I think John was behind it. We were doing silly religions, and there was a bit where some vicar was calling somebody else. Then we followed the wire, and they went up to the next pole, and there was the crucifixion of Christ with the telephone lines going through Jesus' arm. And that was the one thing that bothered John. I have no idea why. That was probably one of the few moments where he snuck behind our backs and got in there." Episode 26, Royal Episode 13.
First time that John read out the sketch about The Undertaker. He read this out, and we all laughed. And then I thought, we can't do that. I thought, well, why can't we do it? I mean, it's not encouraging people to eat their mothers.
Here's a quote from the official Monty Python site. "The notorious Undertaker sketch, in which John Cleese brings his dead mother in a sack to a funeral home only to be offered the option of having her for dinner, was cut on a repeat and lost. A copy of an NTSC recording from North America was the source of reinserting the sketch back into the episode for syndication in the 1980s. Let's just take a moment to thank the early fans of Python for capturing some of this material which would have been otherwise entirely lost. The master tape of this episode cut out the original sketch and replaced it with the railway timetables and Gavin Millar bits, and that was how the episode was repeated for many years in reruns before the discrepancy was fixed. So what we can see now in the episodes both being streamed and on the DVDs is a result of joining in a fan-made or off-air recording of the sketch. By that standard, this must have been the harshest instance of BBC censorship to physically go in and wipe it from the episode. As the sketch survives, it could only be filmed and transmitted if, at the behest of the BBC, the audience had to show audible and visible outrage to the sketch and conclude the episode by storming the stage and interrupting the episode. As you've probably seen, the actual execution of this idea is somewhat clunky. While I do enjoy the idea of getting meta and including the audience, and this potentially being an idea that was hoisted onto the Pythons that they could in turn run with comedically, it's just sort of awkward. People in the audience are ad-libbing insults and jeers over the dialogue, and due to fire marshal restrictions, only some of the audience is able to storm the stage, so seeing one entire section storm the stage but not the rest is pretty unsatisfying. The Undertaker sketch and the preceding lifeboat bits were both included on another Monty Python record in a typically better executed version, and it was also referenced in John Cleese's eulogy for Graham Chapman's funeral as an example of Chapman's adoration for bad taste. The Pythons appeared on the popular chat show Late Night Lineup, hosted by Tony Billow, to talk about the controversial Undertaker finale in Royal Episode 13.
It included the final sketch, which is probably the most tasteless thing you've ever done. The one about cannibalism, mother eating. I don't know.
The one about Late Night Lineup.
This seems to truly be the turning point because before this episode, while there were cuts and bits censored before, the BBC had much more of a presence during the actual tapings of the episodes from this point on, and infamously cut at least a third of a show's material in episode 10 of season 3. Terry Jones also confirms in Life of Python that this was the point at which they were now under close watch at the tapings and even at the script stage by the BBC. In the Python's autobiography titled The Python's Autobiography, Terry Jones admits that since the team held themselves to a high standard and blew through material, they would often find themselves short of material at the end of a season and would therefore resort to smutty humor, or what Jones describes as scatological. This is especially true in the third series with sketches towards the end like the revolting cocktail bar, the wine tasting sketch, or the dirty vicar ending up in almost self-parody. If those first two sketches don't sound familiar, stay tuned. Here's an excerpt of Gilliam from The Python's Autobiography. On the third series, the BBC got interested and tried to censor stuff. What it proved to be was an indication of how sick their minds were, not ours. There was a scene where John thrusts his severed leg through a door to have it signed as a delivery for something. We had this meeting with BBC One controller Paul Fox, and he was talking about this scene where a man pushes his giant penis through the door. What? It's a severed leg, but they saw a giant penis. And Terry Jones corroborates this exact point in a Norwegian interview in 1980, recently uploaded by the Monty Python Museum. Gilliam is also likely referencing the 32 Points of Worry, an internal memo from BBC executives outlining material they wanted altered or removed. God, how I'd like to read this memo. Can someone send that my way if you have access to it? That should be in a broadcast museum by now. What was most certainly on the memo comes next in what is likely the most well-known and well-documented example of censorship throughout the whole series. Episode 31, All England Summarize Proust Competition. Yep, it's the sketch that censored the word masturbating. What's interesting to me is the way in which it's sloppily removed.
So out came the sketch, and it says, strangling animals, golf, pause, huge laugh. Enormous laugh at the word golf. I mean, just ridiculous.
As Michael Palin says in The Pythons, the BBC got to hear about this after it had actually been recorded to an enormous roar of laughter, and they insisted that masturbating had to be removed. Ian had to forcibly go in and just chop it from the transmission tape just before transmission, so there's a horrible sort of gap, and then golf, which got this huge laugh. It's stated in the first 28 years that the word masturbating went out uncensored in American versions, but on the A&E DVDs, it looks more like this.
Well, golf and strangling animals.
Seeing it in all its uncensored glory on the Blu-ray is legitimately exciting. And Chapman said this. And masturbation was cut or changed. We weren't allowed to say that. Ridiculous, isn't it? Some safe pastime like that. An audio version with the masturbating line reinstated was recorded during the session for previous record, but was edged off of the finished album and wouldn't find a home until 1977 on the compilation Monty Python's Instant Record Collection.
Well, strangling animals, golf, and masturbate.
Later in that same episode, in the travel agent sketch, Eric Idle's character, who it's established says the letter B where the letter C should be, says the line, "What a silly bunt." Once again, this is a dirty line that was filmed but cut, despite once again leaving the finished product quite awkward with a burst of laughter and rough editing.
Oh, that's very good. I never thought of that.
And once again, the line was reinstated for its recording on previous record, as well as every subsequent live performance.
I never thought of that. What a silly bunt.
They really should have been able to get away with this one, since they never actually say the word. And by the time of Monty Python's Hollywood Bowl shows, they really didn't give a damn, giving Carol Cleveland free rein to say,
Have you come to arrange a holiday, or would you like a blowjob?
Episode 36, Dr. E. Henry Thripshaw's Disease. This is the episode with by far the most censorship, to the point that entire sections from other episodes had to be flown in to make up the difference, including the E. Henry Thripshaw sketch itself, as well as the Reverend Arthur Belling. This is heavily implied by inside joke script notes on the cover that read, "With very few naughty words." The deleted sections in question are part of Gilliam's Gay Boys in Bondage animation, The Sculptor, The Beekeepers, The Cocktail Bar, and the Wee Wee wine tasting sketch. Those first three live-action bits also appeared in continuum according to the shooting script, with the Wee Wee bit appearing towards the end of the show. Here's a Michael Palin journal entry in September of 1972. Terry J. sees it as part of a plot to keep the BBC out of any major controversies until the charter has been renewed in 1974. Ian McNaughton feels that he will be out soon anyway, as the light entertainment bosses hardly talk to him now, and he is prepared to fight with us against the decision. Maybe we cannot win, but I feel it is as important as anything not to lie down and accept this censorship. John C., for the record, wants to avoid any confrontation with Bill Cotton and Duncan Wood. He wants a chat over dinner and a bit of gentle bargaining. Early on, an animation is noticeably and crudely cut right in the middle and has thankfully been restored. It continues from the Tudor private detective getting arrested and an advertisement for Gay Boys in Bondage. The animation moves from two naked characters interacting to a Bobby throwing someone down a pipe, which then leads to the pipe organ that the nude organist plays, this time in animated form. Presumably, this would have originally cut to the third season opening titles, but it instead abruptly cuts to another sketch with a silly vicar. Here's a journal entry from Michael Palin dated May 25th, 1972. The recording was checkered. Graham was in a very nervous state. He had been worried by his pulse rate, which he said was 108 before the recording, and was drinking as he hasn't done since December and January's recordings. So in one sketch, he skidded to a halt, and it was about 8 retakes and 10 minutes of recording time later that the sketch was eventually completed. That last bit addresses one of the episode's deleted sketches involving Chapman as a sculptor and Cleese as the model, which apparently was shelved when the final product wasn't up to snuff because Chapman was too drunk to commit a good enough performance. Cleese has corroborated this in a 50th anniversary interview looking back on untransmitted sketches, adding that he thought the sketch in theory was rather funny. But it's nice to know that at least one of these sketches was completed, although it's a mystery if it's referring to this sketch or not, and more importantly, maybe this sketch has survived somewhere. There's also a reference to this sketch at the beginning of the last sketch, The Sherry Drinking Vicar, in which we can see a sculpture of the vicar but with a very long nose, which gets a decent laugh but is also just randomly amusing on its own merit. Even less is known about the Beekeeper sketch, but it's likely that it suffers the same fate as the previous bit and was mangled at the recording stage due to Chapman's state. It's possible that this was filmed and completed, but no video exists to date. Like the other sketches deleted from the episode, you can still find it scripted. Also, in the From Spam to Sperm music documentary within the Python Night 30th Anniversary special, there is a 10-second excerpt from a tape recording of Michael Palin singing what sounds like a less developed version of the Half a Bee song with different lyrics, which may have been closer to this original version.
Marching along with half a bee, singing a song with half a bee.
Musically, it sort of resembles the beginning of either the Spam song or the Accountancy Shanty song. It's fascinating reading the script to this sketch as it explains how the Half a Bee idea came about, originally as part of a King Solomon split the baby in half sort of deal that results in a song. I really wish we could hear the Fred Tomlinson singers continue to change genres, like on Here Comes Another One. Then again, maybe it's best that this was cut, otherwise we wouldn't have had the Eric the Half a Bee song as we know and love it today on Monty Python's previous record, which expands on the Fish License sketch from Season 2, Episode 10, with a new ending. And as recently as last year on John Cleese's Dinosaur Hour on the dreaded GB News Network, he performed Eric the Half a Bee for the first time since previous record, and with Python and solo Python contributor John Dupre in tow on piano. Groovy.
How about a dog turd and tonic?
Moderate fans of Monty Python would recognize this cocktail bar sketch in its audio form, as it was performed by the Pythons live for a time, even appearing on the Live at Drury Lane album in full. It appears that the sketch was certainly rehearsed, but perhaps not filmed or finished. But it's possible the bit was filmed, and in the finished episode we still get an animation of animals dropping into a mixed drink shaker thing that was likely originally intended as a link.
There was one very silly sketch which John always hated and collaborated with the BBC to cut, I think.
And I remember that I found myself on the side of the establishment.
Shh. The Wee Wee sketch. One of the only times I've actually seen any of them discuss it on film is in the documentary The Life of Python. From the Python's autobiography, John Cleese says, I thought that the amount that the BBC interfered was absolutely minimal, and on a couple of occasions I totally agreed with them. Eric wrote a sketch about urine, which I thought was tasteless. I found it embarrassing. I accepted that the others didn't, but I found it embarrassing. Then I thought it was absolutely fine for the BBC to interfere on that. To which Eric Idle responds, John was upset, but that sketch was about snobbery, not wee-wee. Michael Palin in The Pythons. John was absolutely in agreement with Bill Cotton, and it was the first time ever that someone brought in an outsider. That would normally have been dealt with within the group, but that was quite significant. I think John brought Bill in because he felt it wasn't a good sketch and it wasn't working. It was abandoned in the end anyway, but there were many other small problems that we had during that third series. The sketch, written by Idle and Palin, was pushed to be censored by the BBC, in particular by trailblazing BBC One controller Sir Paul Fox, who by the way left the BBC shortly after this incident. Cleese has said in the past that he believes it's okay to use rude and dirty material, but only if there's a purpose. Terry Jones, on the other hand, seems indifferent, effectively saying the sketch was okay, more of an exercise in bad taste than anything, and that they were running thin on material by that time in the series. In fact, Palin also agrees that the third series began to rely heavily on bad taste, and was often not as good as the previous two. I, however, disagree because my favorite episode was still to come, A Book at Bedtime. Here's a quote from Graham Chapman. "I had always imagined that the Wee Wee sketch had been broadcast, but I know it was controversial at the time," said Chapman. Lamentably, John was on the side of the authorities on that one, and in fact almost alerted them to this wee-wee sketch, which had, I think, partly subconsciously been written with the idea of annoying John. And here's a journal entry from Michael Palin dated May 25th, 1972. "The last Python TV recording for at least 18 months. Our last show contains the wee-wee wine taster, Tudor Jobs, with a long bit for myself, both sketches which John doesn't like at all. So there's a slight tenseness in the air. It's a very busy last show with plenty for everyone to do and only a small amount of film. A fairly smooth day's rehearsal, but it was unusual to see Duncan Wood and Bill Cotton at our final run-through. Apparently, they later told Ian that there would have to be cuts in the show. This is the first time they've ever suggested any censorship in what has been quite an outspoken series. That had to be depressing to have the last TV taping with Cleese still in the group to be fraught with tension and censorship." Season 4, Episode 2, Michael Ellis. In the fourth series, there was pressure to remove a few offending lines from the Michael Ellis episode. The Icelandic Honey Week sketch eventually appears in the final episode, but it was actually initially filmed for the Michael Ellis episode and takes place inside the department store after Chris Quinn buys his aunt and just before he enters that goofy elevator. Michael Palin alludes to this in his diary, stating, "In Graham's speech as the Icelandic Honey Week rep, very funny and all recorded, they wanted the lines, 'cold enough to freeze your balls off, freeze the little buggers solid in midair,' cut from the tape, as well as one, 'piss off, we could keep the other.'" Jimmy had apparently said very strongly to Ian that if and when Python Productions made their own series, they could say what they like, but for now, they must accept what the BBC say. Censorship, in fact. "Yes," says Jimmy, referring to Jimmy Gilbert, BBC's head of comedy. "It is censorship. We had already burned off most of our frustrated anger at the BBC's decision to omit the word condom from that show. I mean, if condom is considered a bannable word on British TV in 1974, what hope is there? Don't worry, Mike. Jimmy Gilbert is the same guy who predicted Fawlty Towers would be a disaster." Incidentally, as the line appears, the character doesn't say piss off, but rather that they are pissed off. Ultimately, that Icelandic Honey Week sketch later appeared in a bit more neutered form, and the censorship of the word condom comes shortly after in the elevator with Palin's withered old lady character as the door closes. It's been changed from Kitty's condoms to Kitty's vasectomies, which is funny too, but once you notice it, the audio overdub is quite noticeable. It's at this point that I can't completely confirm any other material has been cut at the insistence of the BBC or because of poor taste, or bits that might have been cut inexplicably like Gilliam's animation of the trees in space in Hitler, or quick bits of dialogue like in Biggles Dictates a Letter, but it would only be speculation at this point. However, I highly recommend the website Some of the Corpses Are Amusing to fill in the rest of the gaps in material removed. All in all, seeing the trajectory of censorship battles weaves a tale in such a short time of the group dynamic, of how much they believed in their material, of how their bad taste and touchy material helped differentiate the Pythons from their contemporaries and define their identity, and to see how once a show starts getting popular, it usually starts getting reined in and the edges sanded off. But for a few years there, Monty Python helped to usher in a new generation of comedy, left on a mission, which was to... I can't read this drivel.
I preferred the dirty version.